Welcome. Today's talk is family and local history. You can't have one without the other. And I'm Heidi. I'm the family history librarian for Eastern Regional Library, as many of you have met me. And any of you who haven't, when we reopen, feel free to drop in and say hello. I'm at Croydon. And today's talk will be done as a PowerPoint presentation. So let me just share my screen with everyone. And we will get started.
Okay.
So, family and local history. You can't have one without the other. According to the Cambridge Dictionary, history is the study of or a record of past events considered together, especially events of a particular period, country, or subject. So what do we mean by local history? The study of a defined area. That area could be a country, region, council area, a suburb, a piece of land, a building, or a place across which different people move. The focus of that study being a place, a building, residential or retail, or a smaller area. Could also be the effect of time on a certain place and also different people bringing different influences. Thus, the events that have affected that area, either man-made or natural. So what do we mean by family history? So in the traditional sense, family is a group of people who are related by blood. So family history is the research into the members of a set family and their actions, relationships, and movements. While birth, marriage, and death certificates are fantastic primary sources, they are just one of the steps in finding out how much we can about each person and how they lived. Genealogy versus family history. Let's take a little step to the side and define the differences. Genealogy is the recorded information, for example, the births, marriages, and deaths of people in a family tree. While family history includes the genealogy, it is so much more. It's the stories, the interactions, the events, and everything else to do with a family group and how, where, why they did what they did. So let's go back and look at our original question. Family versus local history. Can we have one without the other or not? So now we know the meaning of both local and family history. Let's have a look at why we might need both and why you can't do without one or the other. So why do people do family history and want to do this type of research? To record a family's history, to preserve for all time the history of that family group. To verify family stories, determine if the family stories about the ancestors are true or not. Historical events, the involvement of relatives in a historical event or not. Trace, to track down all descendants back to discover where they came from. Medical, to trace a medical issue through the family, whereas that's not something that we do regularly or why we do it regularly, but it is something that some people do family history for. So ultimately, people do family history to know what has happened before them and why. A family's history. Describe the family's activities and how they lived. Places the family in its historical, geographical, social, and occupational contexts. based on a completed genealogy and other historical sources. How do we do this? Using genealogy, so our primary records, and other historical records. These can include birth, marriage and death records, electoral rolls, rate books, school registers, shipping records, war service records, newspaper articles, gazettes, both state and police, are just a few places we can look. So how does that impact or location impact? The location or local area can, did, and still does impact on the lives of a family to a very high degree. What has happened in the local environment at a specific time, which we now consider history, that family lived there. Immigration. We all know that everyone in Australia had to come here at some time in the past. It could have been 60,000 years ago when the Aboriginal people walked here, or by ship during the 18 and 1900s, or more recently by plane. But why did they come? What were the reasons for your ancestors to come? Did they stay for a while? Did some return to where they came from? Or did they stay? Again, why? As a convict, as an immigrant, in the military, as a refugee, a free settler, or tracing that elusive gold. All of these reasons may have had an impact on the local environment at the time. So let's look at that in a bit more depth. Crime. Your ancestor did something, was arrested, tried, convicted, and then transported to another country. Sometimes it was for a minor offence, like stealing a loaf of bread. Other times it was a serious offence, such as murder. Either way, they were tried, found guilty, sentenced to transportation, and sent. Occasionally, they did arrest the wrong people and convict them. Either way, families were separated, and this heavily impacted the family group and its history. Occupation. Developing technologies, and no, I don't mean computers, I mean machines such as railroad, steam engines, printing presses, etc., all impacted the workforce. Many previously skilled workers were forced out of their jobs as machines were taking over. Not as many people were needed to run them, needing breaks or paying, and productivity levels significantly increased. Or their job no longer existed. Carters, who moved goods over long distances, were no longer needed as railroads now moved the goods instead. Resources were not as highly in abundance as they were in earlier times, as many resources were becoming depleted, especially in the mining areas. Ever improving medical care. People were starting to live longer and have larger families as death rates of infants decreased due to better understanding and treating of various medical conditions and general health care. Into the 20th century, as automobiles, trains and other machines took the jobs of horses, stable hands, coachmen and other associated jobs, people lost their positions as horses were no longer required and thus did not need looking after any longer. Domestic servants. Less people were needed as technologies were introduced into the houses. Also, the introduction of electricity and the associated progress in all areas of life made many jobs and skills no longer required. But back to the 17 and 1800s. as this was the time period that statistically showed that the significant influx of people immigrating to other countries. Many could not find work at home and looked for opportunities in the New World, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and America. Or they were in the military, shipping or similar, and told they had to go, and either took their families or went alone, many never returning, leaving their families to fend for themselves. Money. No job? Large families? This usually led to very little or no money, especially in the lower classes. Many wanted to access new opportunities provided by the New World through commerce, farming, construction, or on the goldfields. Famine. The Irish potato famine during the middle of the 1800s is possibly the most well-known, but other famines occurred too, at different times and in different places all around the world, and have done so for thousands of years. Famine caused many deaths, and with no relief in sight, many families opted for the unknown and hoped for a better life for the family group away from the issue of that time and place. War. Wars have always caused upheaval, from desecration of land, destroyed homes, farms, and villages, and families severely injuries and deaths of thousands upon thousands, usually men who went away to fight. If the land was no longer viable to crops or animal husbandry, how did the local people who hadn't been killed themselves survive? They moved elsewhere. Dead men could not support their families. Pensions and insurance policies, as we know them today, just didn't exist. Many families relied on a small amount of money that the soldiers were paid and sent back to help them live. If a soldier died, he could not return and take up his old occupation or run the family farm. If he did come back but was severely injured, he may never be able to work again. He could have been a bigger drain on the family, as he was another mouth to feed, clothe, provide housing. He may also have needed constant care, causing another person that could earn money for the family away from that role to care for him. Or maybe he became addicted to the bottle, as many did, to deal with the pain of his injuries, again, taking money away from the family coffers. Many men coming back to reduce number of jobs due to the technological developments of the time, especially at the end of the war, and lots of men were all returning at the same time. Lots of people looking for work and only a few jobs available caused massive unemployment. Persecution. Throughout history, people worldwide have been persecuted for their religious, cultural, and political beliefs. In many cases, the only way to escape was to leave and start again somewhere far away, if they could. Thus, the impact did affect the family group in quite profound ways. Unfortunately, this is still happening today. Pressures. Pressures to form alliances or marriages for money, land, and power have always been an issue, especially in the upper classes, nobility, and royalty. Families could also put pressure on people to marry or not marry for other reasons and in other classes too. Some eloped, others left the country. Others just left the town of their ancestors and changed their names when starting up somewhere else, either as a single person, couple, or family. Pressure could also come from within the immediate family. A husband could no longer cope with the demands of a family and left, never to be heard from again. Living conditions. Overcrowding, slums, no work, limited food, deplorable hygiene conditions, large families, etc. All these affected the family group. Many families felt they had to escape with the hopes of a better life somewhere else. Sea change. Others just wanted to try something new for no particular reason. So the impact on the family group. So how do you think these events or situations would impact the family group? Thus, the local history or events, culture, and social situation that has impacted on the family group and its history. Crime. Do you think a family would be able to just carry on as if nothing has changed if the main income earner was suddenly arrested and shipped off to the colonies for nothing more than stealing a loaf of bread or a handkerchief? Change. The whole family situation would change, and usually not for the better. The family is divided. Few families could avoid to join their convicted family member in the new country. Most convicts never return to their home country, as that was one of the conditions of transportation. Many convicts found a new spouse, had a new family, and never saw or heard from their first family ever again. The family left behind was left to deal with the loss of the convicted family member's possible income or child-minding ability, and may have ended up in the workhouse, as there were little other options in the 1700s and 1800s. Let's look at another family. This family chose to immigrate by choice. They arrived in Australia and headed for the goldfields. What happened to them there? Death, starvation, cramped conditions, violence, crime, and maybe even death. Thus, the ramifications of these events on the family again. Or, against all odds, they strike it rich, really rich. Rich enough to purchase some land, purchase stock, build a big house, and employ staff. Thus, prosperity or not. The change in social situation will change the direction of their lives yet again, putting them in contact with a different class of people, perceived differently to those that work for them, but possibly not accepted by their now peers, as seen as interlopers. Over time, the children grow up with education, which they wouldn't have had before, marry into other families of similar social situations. Their lives are very different to what they would have been like if they had not found that significant gold strike. The impact of the family on the community. What roles do the various members of the family play in the local community, if any? Church, politics, sport, social groups, schools, scouting, business. Decisions or actions that the family group member or members make, either alone or along with other members of a group, can change the course of history in that location, as well as the history of that family group. Some examples in no specific order include Captain Cook's arrival, Don Bradman, David Mitchell, Eureka Stockade, Federation, the Catholic Church, the LGBT movement, the Italians arriving in the Yarra Valley. All of those people or groups have had a big impact on the community in one way or another. Money. There's always two sides to the money in local community, the givers and the takers. Those who have it to spend or give and those who don't. This can impact on the local facilities, economics, and also leading to class wars depending on the size of the local community. the amount of money involved, and how it was spent or not. War. World War or feuding families. Many families have impacted on war and the war on the families. If nobody had signed up to fight during wartime, how would the lives of the family group have changed? Would we all be speaking Japanese now? All these men and women who died overseas, if they didn't die, would they have married, had their own children? And different boundaries of land ownership, because these were fought over. How many people were injured, killed, etc.? How did a feud impact the wider community? Did others take sides or not? Or other impacts? Population. Large or small numbers of children, lengths of lives, illness or prosperity all impact on the location. The more people is growth of a community, but also requires more food, facilities, housing, jobs, etc. But at the same time, if there's not as many people, a community can die as well. People would need to go further and further away to get the items they require or move away completely. Change. Thus, the family and its members are constantly bringing change to affect a community or local history. In conclusion, family history impacts on the local history, and local history impacts on family history. As you've heard and seen, think about your family and its various ancestors. What did they do? Where did they come from? Where did they go? How did the social and economic environment affect them? Do you think if they had stayed in their original ancestral area, their lives would have been the same? Remember, the impact of their lives have impacted on your life. Your parents, grandparents, or even generations further back may have never met. If they didn't meet and produce children, you, as you are today, would never have been born. I hope I have ultimately convinced you that family and local history go arm in arm, and ultimately you can't have one without the other.